Today we are looking at the decidedly unoptimistically titled When Money Dies by Adam Fergusson. This was written in 1975 and it's about the hyperinflation that existed in Germany between the First and Second World Wars. I appreciate that's a bit of very niche history and some economics, kind of niche economics as well, I suppose. So it's unlikely to be particularly widely appealing, but it is actually very interesting, not least in the context that it's a big part of what linked the First and Second World Wars. This book does quite a good job, I think, of helping to illustrate what some of that midpoint was. I believe most people are aware of, someone mentions Weimar Republic or something, which was broadly the system of government that existed between the end of the Second World War and the start of the First World War. And the hyperinflation, you probably heard the anecdotes about people, instead of having your money in a wallet, you'd have it in a wheelbarrow because it would cost billions to go and do your weekly shop. Or you go out for dinner and you sit down and the price at the start of your meal is lower than the price at the end because the prices are rising that fast. So like a proper hellish sort of thing, given in the UK we had inflation, I think it hit 11% at one point, and everyone's going nuts over it. And this is absolutely insane numbers. I mean, it's just complete devaluing of money. There's a Douglas Adams concept he talks in one of his books about having a fiscal system based on leaves, where instead of fivers you've got leaves, and of course there are so many of them that the whole thing just doesn't make any real sense. But that's basically what Germany did to their currency during that period. The book, inevitably being sort of niche history and niche economics, it's a difficult thing to claim was much fun, but it is really interesting, and partly, or mostly I think actually, in terms of how it links the First and Second World Wars. There's this interesting school of thought that the First and Second World War were broadly the same thing, in that, as Baldrick put it, the First World War started because Archduke shot an ostrich, and then Rowan Atkinson explains it perhaps better when he says it was too much trouble not to have a war, and that's why they had the First World War. And then the way Germany was treated after the First World War, trying to squeeze out all the reparations and all the rest of it, and the state they were left in helped to create the fertile ground that then helped Hitler to rise to power, which probably wouldn't have done, or perhaps wouldn't have done, if it wasn't for the conditions set after the First World War. And that then led into the Second World War, perhaps even inevitably to some extent. It's a horrible idea, isn't it? The whole thing, both wars potentially avoidable. And despite the fact that potentially some good has come from both wars, in the sense that hopefully we've learned some lessons as a society, a global society, it is nevertheless a disappointing idea that the whole thing was avoidable and just came down to a lot of people being muppets. Or if you'd taken out some of the muppets, then perhaps it could never have happened. I had always had the idea that Germany had deliberately devalued their currency by printing lots and lots of money in order to help settle their debt. That just seems sort of logical, but cynical. And I know a lot of people who say that today, of governments trying to generate inflation, they're trying to inflate their debt away. And I think that's perhaps giving modern stuff a bit too much credit, maybe, but I had assumed that was the case in 1920s Germany. But no, apparently it seems, well, according to Adam Fergusson, it's demonstrably the case that wasn't true, and they were actually just a bunch of muppets who didn't even realise that printing all that money was actually the cause of the inflation, and seemed to be that the prices would go up, so they would print more money to try and counteract it. And these days you just chop the money supply, whack interest rates up and bring it back down, as what's happened here recently. It seems in Germany they hadn't figured that out yet, or rather plenty of people had figured that out, but none of them were running Germany at the time. I also hadn't realised that it was actually quite a long period, because 1923 is the year most associated with the pinnacle of all that. But I gather it goes back all the way to the First World War and ran on a little bit afterwards, and wasn't actually resolved until they managed to get people to have some faith in money again, basically by scrapping the old currency they had and replacing it with a new one. Basically just knocking off like 12 zeros, whatever it was, ridiculous sort of thing. But of course that doesn't work unless people actually have faith in it. But that's one of the problems of these non-backed currencies. I think a lot of people think currency in the UK and America is all backed by gold, and it certainly used to be, but it hasn't been since the 70s, I think, or 72, I think it was. So it's what's called a fiat currency, in that it's just what the government says. So if you have no faith in your government, then money becomes worthless, and that's what happened in Germany. But they were able to rebuild that confidence and sort it out. So, yeah, I mean, I guess they could have done that at any point if they got themselves together, but clearly Muppetry is a big feature of this period, unfortunately. I quite often run into people who talk about worries of inflation. They link back to this Weimar episode, and you can't help but feel it's a little bit ridiculous, because, I mean, that's just the most ridiculous circumstance and the most ridiculous extent and the most incompetent of management by a government. Well, yeah, okay, maybe I can see where they're coming from in some of it. But there are modern examples of hyperinflation, perhaps not to the extent of that Weimar Germany suffered, but Venezuela, for example, I gather their inflation rate has just come down to 75%. And in the UK, certainly, everyone lost their heads when we hit 11 in blind panic. So coming down to 75, let's start using different currencies. Albeit that's actually, a lot of that was what happened in Germany. They apparently started bartering coal and potatoes and cigarettes and that sort of thing. So I guess people do find their way around it. But still, not a good thing for stability in a country. Another idea I found particularly interesting in this, which isn't particularly overt in the book actually, but I guess is relevant because it's sort of what's going on now, is Hitler's rise to power largely occurred because people were trying to get away from what they had. And granted, the people running Germany at this point were clearly spectacular muppets, so they had to go one way or another. But it does sound like they paid less attention to what they were voting for and more attention to what they were voting to get away from. And that's something that's happened a little bit in the UK recently, where everyone wanted the Conservatives out because they've been rubbish. And, it's difficult for anyone to argue otherwise. But they voted for something that they didn't really seem to think through, or a lot of people didn't seem to think through, in terms of they were thinking about getting away from something, not what they were going to have instead. And it's, not disastrous, hopefully, and certainly not really any world wars or anything, so not likening anyone to Hitler. But that mentality of just get away from this thing, not think about where you're going, it's absolutely nuts. But it does seem to be a huge thing. And it was a lesson potentially could have been learned from this episode in 1923, and 101 years later, people are doing, I can't be careful saying similar things, obviously, but voting to get away from things rather than voting to go towards things. Very odd and slightly disappointing state for society. But anyway, yeah, it's a good book. I mean, if you're not really interested in history or economics, maybe give it a miss. But I mean, it's nicely written. It's easy to read. It's interesting. That's about as much as I can say for it. Maybe some interesting ideas in there. If anyone's read it and picked out anything that I didn't, I'd love to hear about it.